Chapter 3. The news of Phase 5 of the Chungli virus leaked out during the summer and was followed by widespread rioting in those parts of the Far East that were nearest to the focus of infection. By a policy of destroying infected crops and clearing the ground for some distance around them, it was hoped to keep the spread of the virus in check until a means could be found of eradicating it entirely.
Okay. I'm going to stop that there. What you just heard there is one of my favourite disaster fiction audiobooks in my playlist here on my smartphone. It's a typical post-apocalyptical novel from the mid-20th century that portrays a world where a virus has wiped out all grasses. That includes rice, wheat and other staple crops. And this, of course, quickly leads to a global famine and nations and societies disintegrating. And it's called The Death of Grass. And was written by the British author John Christopher. And even though parts of it are, rather dated, I do still enjoy listening to it from time to time, particularly also against the backdrop of what is happening these days. You know, we mustn't forget that viruses, they can't just cause pandemics to us humans, they can also attack plants. And there is science that proves that warmer and wetter weather has increased the spread of plant viruses in the past decades. And that's also something that could intensify with climate change. So maybe John Christopher was onto something in 1956 when he wrote The Death of Grass. Yeah, and all this, there is a reason why I'm telling you this. It brings me directly to what this episode is about. It's about climate fiction and the question whether climate fiction or cli-fi is a useful tool, or is it in fact counterproductive when tackling the global threat of climate change? My name is Neil King, and this is On the Green Fence. So, following on from the last episode, in which I took a closer look at how the genre of climate fiction or cli-fi evolved, and the impact it has been having in contemporary culture, I wanted to go a bit deeper into the psychological impact cli-fi has on the reader or viewer. And so I got in touch with Katharine Steentjes. She's an environmental psychologist and researcher at the Centre for Climate Change and Social Transformations at Cardiff University, Wales. And before getting into the details, I started our chat by asking her how she feels about climate fiction.
So I think it's a really good creative tool to kind of contribute to that discourse about climate change and sense-making around climate change, I think. So I think it's a really good tool, to be honest.
But I mean, some critics, they say that it's actually quite counterproductive, especially if it goes, into the dystopian spectrum, that it can just paralyze people, depress them, and they end up doing nothing.
That's a fair point, and that is a danger. So I do think that climate fiction, like any climate communication, any kind of way we talk about it, can be productive and counterproductive if we talk about climate action. So there's definitely an element of having to do it right, if that makes sense. So at least if the ultimate goal for you is to kind of make people feel empowered and, contribute towards kind of climate action, solving the issue of climate change, because climate change in itself, it's such a scary, vast issue that it is quite easy to feel paralyzed. And we also know that a lot of people do feel paralyzed. And when people don't see an effective way out, when they don't feel empowered that their actions matter and that there is something that we can all do to solve this problem, then they just sit with that fear, and then that's very paralyzing.
I mean, you're an environmental psychologist, right? I mean, if we were to look at, how the consumption of cli-fi affects people psychologically, are there any patterns there that you see when people consume cli-fi?
Yeah, definitely. So, I kind of touched on the kind of emotion. So obviously fiction and is kind of there to elicit some emotions in, the people consuming it. And we know from the psychological literature how important emotions are in our decision-making, in our sense-making, in our behaviors. So, for example, when we think about, I mentioned fear. So that's actually quite a paralyzing emotion. So if you feel fear, then often it's more like taking yourself out of the situation, retracting yourself rather than really dealing with the issue. So then you might kind of engage more in kind of responses such as not wanting to hear about it, or kind of, blocking it away, or kind of minimizing the issue and saying, oh yeah, but somehow, somewhere we'll solve it. So you kind of then have that, kind of reaction of just disengaging. Whereas when you have other emotions, I mean, anger, for example, is quite a motivating emotion. So, it kind of leads to, for example, actions of protest. We see that a lot with young people recently, that they get really angry about how current generation, politicians, current generations kind of deal with the issue. So that's like a very empowering emotion. And another emotion that's quite important is the emotion of hope. And I feel like that's often talked about in the context of climate change. And there is some hope, there's something we can do. There's maybe even a better future if we really consider climate change. Like a low carbon future can actually come with a lot of positives. So that feeling of hope, of overcoming that big issue, and that kind of also links to what we call in psychology feelings of efficacy, which means basically that you believe that either your own action or your collective actions are actually effective in overcoming an issue or like a risk that you see. So in the context of climate change, that means like, if something kind of gives you the feeling of like, yes, we can do this, if only we all act together and then we can do this specific thing, then that's very empowering. And again, we can see that leads to behaviors, and it's quite an important factor in making people act.
This is the worst news in the history of humanity. He just blew us off.
What are we gonna do? We have to release the information.
So we just leak it.
Our guests today have made a pretty big discovery in space.
How big is this thing, though? Can it destroy my ex-wife's house? Is that possible?
There's a 100% chance that we're all going to die.
If we were to apply this then to a concrete example, because I also spoke to an interviewee who also mentioned the film Don't Look Up, and he felt actually that it had an important message to convey. But it has been quite a controversial film, right? Because it's more of a metaphor in some ways, because it's about a comet and not so much about climate change. But it's clear to a lot of people what they're trying to say, right? But I mean, does this, if you were to use these categories now, how does Don't Look Up come out of that? Is it a film that is helping, or is it counterproductive?
Well, I think I would start by saying, kind of questioning whether actually a lot of people did understand that metaphor. And obviously if that's not understood, then that's already kind of difficult to achieve what it's trying to do, I guess. So I do think there was a lot of good things in there. And if you kind of understood and saw the link with climate change, then, it's picking up on a lot of the things that I think people feel, that already, the kind of people that already worry about climate change and trying to talk about solutions and trying to realize change. I feel like those people definitely will have connected with a lot of things in that movie, kind of picking up on how people are, how they're ridiculed when they're just trying to, communicate, but we all, we need to really address this. It's coming at us. We can't ignore it away. So I feel like those people will probably have felt like quite validated in, their feelings and their frustration with regards to climate change. So I think in that sense, that can create quite a nice kind of community feel and kind of like a validation. However, I'm not that sure it kind of really would do the same thing for people who are not already kind of thinking about climate change and kind of engaged with climate change a lot, because it was quite abstract in that metaphor that it used. And also, as I just mentioned, it ended quite negatively, right? So like it kind of ended in, oh, we're all gonna die. And if we say, okay, that's a metaphor for climate change, but then, okay, that means we're all gonna die, then that kind of, again, causes that feeling of paralysis that I mentioned before, of kind of like, yeah, but what can we do then? So all that's left for us to do is enjoy our lives as long as we live, like if we take it to the extreme. But it, again, didn't really convey a way out or a good solution, rather than just kind of conveying, okay, it's really difficult and it's probably just not worth trying to solve it, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So in that sense, it is a really interesting one. And I'm not saying it's not done something right, but I'm just questioning whether it actually will have motivated and engaged people that weren't already worried and engaged about climate change.
Yeah. I mean, I remember watching that film. I mean, parts of it, I thought was just hilarious. It was so funny. And then there were other parts where it was just so sobering. And of course, the ending, it had like two endings, didn't it, in a way? I mean, the ending on planet Earth, and then the other ending where they land on this planet with the dinosaurs and then end up getting, eaten.
Yeah.
If you were to sort of, cite an example where you feel this is a good example of cli-fi that is going in the right direction, it has the potential to galvanize people into action, and it's pressing all the right buttons, psychologically speaking, to turn this into something positive and not sort of make us cower in our rooms and feel isolated and impotent.
Now you're putting me on the spot.
I mean, you can also speak personally if there's anything that you felt after reading a certain novel from this genre or seeing a certain film or series. I mean, there are a lot of new series also coming out right now, right?
Yeah.
That fit the cli-fi label. I mean, is there anything where you sort of feel like after watching it, that this is a good one, this is going to change the game and push people in the right direction?
I really can't think of an example that personally caught me. I think in general, what I would say, it's really the kind of stories that people, A, can really connect with, and that B, they can relate to, right? So I think it's often the kind of stories, for me at least, that kind of are happening, they're kind of really based in some kind of real experiences. And again, even if that's like a novel or a story or a movie, like for me, it's really something that is quite close to someone's real life, So we also know from our research, it's kind of personal experiences and people who actually say, for example, live with climate change or live with the impacts, or in countries that are more clearly living with the consequences of climate change already than we may be feeling here. So that's one thing that I think is quite interesting. And the other thing that I think in terms of the, almost the other extreme that I think is really helpful, or that the kind of stories that kind of bring together like a kind of really positive vision of the future. So I think a lot of those visions of low carbon futures and the way we have to change are quite negative, or kind of give the impression we have to give up loads of things. Whereas I think there's a lot of positives, there's a lot of kind of maybe focus more on communities, smaller communities, which come with maybe better social networks or increased well-being, because you know what I mean? Like there's a lot of things in the kind of decentralizing, decarbonizing our lifestyles that I think are quite positive. So I quite like the kind of stories that focus on aspects of life and kind of aspects of that are really nice and visionary. And
I didn't want to put you on the spot there, but I think it's also part of it. The problem is with that question that I asked you is that I think the majority of the cli-fi that is out there is in fact dystopian, or at least that's my experience. So, and for some reason, I'm actually quite optimistic in this regard. I do feel quite optimistic that we can turn the things around and that we can actually turn things into, or societies into, something better than we have right now. I mean, I do see the trends that are going in the other direction, and that, it's taking a long time for us to change course.
And I think, I'm not trying to I do think there is a purpose of that as well. Having talked to authors of dystopian kind of cli-fi, I think often it's not really their purpose or goal to motivate people, but maybe just to kind of provide an outlet for that kind of fear and that kind of sense making of climate change. So I think in that sense, even the dystopian one, even though from a communications point of view and as an environmental psychologist, I'm saying it's maybe not the best thing to get people motivated, but maybe it is part of the process, right? Maybe it's, as a society, we hear a lot about how devastating the consequences of climate change are. There are a lot of expert reports and information that go through the media that we are confronted with. So I feel like there is a bit of a vacuum that people are left with, that fear about climate change without real sense of, but what does that really mean? When we talk about, the planet is warming more than 1.5 degrees, that feels quite abstract and we don't really understand what that means. And when experts say, okay, if we warm to 4 degrees, that's going to be devastating. But those numbers are not something we can imagine or relate to very easily. So I do think there is a purpose of playing maybe through those extremes and kind of trying to make sense of what does that mean? So when we talk about 4 degrees, that actually means a lot of parts of the world are not going to be livable. We don't actually know exactly what it's going to do to the stabilization of our global climate. There's a lot of uncertainty, and I do think that maybe even the dystopian stories have a purpose in contributing to that sense making and that kind of general discourse around climate change, even though maybe they're not the most motivating stories.
But that also brings me to, I was sort of building up to that, the fact that, despite having a positive outlook on life or being an optimist, I am drawn to these dystopian narratives. And I do find it quite compelling, reading, and this is not just cli-fi, this is also science fiction. If I think like novels, Day of the Triffids or The Death of Grass, or all these, the Tripods series, all these things where I'm sort of drawn to. And I think with cli-fi, it would be the same, although I haven't read so many of these novels. And I'm sort of wondering, is this something, psychologically speaking, why is that? Is this sort of also, why do people like this dystopian genre? I mean, is it like with horror movies, the same sort of psychology going on, that you like to put yourself in scary places and then the relief afterwards, that you realize, oh, I'm actually not in this movie?
Maybe, yeah. I think, that's the psychology behind horror movies, isn't it? To kind of get that thrill while knowing exactly that you're safe, So I guess maybe there is something in that as well. So, and I think it is something that even as people who kind of like are quite engaged with climate change, or even myself who deals with a lot of kind of expert projections. So I think we just need to imagine things in a different way. Like I mentioned emotions, but it's also about breaking out of the concepts of our current kind of boundaries of how we live, because that's like we always relate everything to what we know, right? So, and then maybe breaking out of that and kind of really just like, okay, but what do these numbers really mean? Like, can we really imagine what that looks like? And I kind of do agree, like even for me, like I do think it's quite nice to play around with that, or maybe get an idea of like, how would that affect our lives? Like, how would that really feel to live in that world? Because I guess novels and movies, they're not just kind of, okay, this is the situation, this is how it is, but it's actually creating emotions and network, like the complete story in life that we can kind of like dip in, I guess, and then see what it's like, and then maybe, but also dip out again because it's just a story. So yeah, so I do think it's quite natural in a way, and maybe it is a bit similar to horror movies. The difference is that it's
real.
It's real, or could be real, right? So yeah.
I'm also wondering in that regard, because the difference there, as you said, the horror movies, that's all complete fiction, of course. With cli-fi, that it could be true. We don't really know yet. And I'm sort of wondering whether some of this, psychologically speaking, could also be us wanting to be able to react or be prepared for the worst case scenario.
Definitely, yeah.
So that we're not caught completely unawares. I
think that's it. And I think in terms of when we see how people respond to kind of general risks or kind of, crises, I do definitely think there are individual differences, that some people, as you say, they're kind of playing through the worst case and then kind of feel better prepared and better, more resilient if they kind of psychologically prepare for the worst case, whereas other people who probably don't engage with these kind of genre, other people are more kind of coping with it by kind of disengaging or not. I think there's, like with every risk and every threat that we face, there are different coping mechanisms, and I think this is just one of the.
Yeah. I think it kind of would be nice if along the way with the narrative of these novels or these stories, if we had more crossroads where you'd have a branch off to the worst case scenario, depending how you act, or the best case scenario. If we could elaborate a bit more on the best case scenarios, I don't know, I think that could be quite motivating if you could see actually, because this is something, having done this podcast now for a while and talked to so many interesting people and experts, and at times I do get quite excited because it seems to me that certain fundamentals, which we never questioned, or rarely question, on a broader scale before the pandemic or before the climate crisis, we are looking at these really with the realistic option of changing something fundamentally as to how we live and engage with each other. And this, I don't know, it feels to me like we do live in a time of possibility, and sometimes I feel like that gets a bit lost. It's more about as if we're constantly being hounded by the climate crisis and we're just reacting and everything's too slow. But I don't know, I do sometimes, feel like if we could get the message across that if we make the right decisions and smart decisions, we could actually end up in a better place.
Yeah, I agree. And it's kind of, I think, the real part of the problem, or what we, we know people are worried, as I said, but, it's kind of, it's almost that, we call it delays and more the kind of disengagement to some degree. And I think it's, as you say, it's very much rooted in the fact that, we also see that when we ask people about in focus groups or surveys, now, we ask them about like, okay, this is kind of a different future. So imagine like a different economy, like sharing economy, that different concept than the one that we're living in right now. What do you think of it? And a lot of people, there's a lot of positives that people see in those other concepts or other lifestyles. But then they question whether it's really possible, right? So then they kind of come back to how it is right now. And they're like, yeah, but why would businesses get on board with this? Or why would politicians this? Or, why, I'm sure there would just be people like not getting on, people wouldn't support it, so there's these kind of very practical concerns or issues that people bring up that are kind of rooted in the here and now, which is totally fair. But I think I kind of agree, like if we could just break through that, and I feel like COVID is a good example, right? Like no one ever thought possible that people would like let their lives be restricted in the way that we did, and at the same time like people coped, right? I think people are more resilient than we think. So people started to focus on the, at least in their kind of limits and in their, depending on their situation, but, trying to focus on the positives, on mental health. There were suddenly other things were more important than maybe the things that are kind of dictating our lives on a day-to-day basis. So I totally agree that there is, as human beings, as society, like we could be quicker, and there's like actually like more possibilities than we can actually imagine right now. And I also think there's a lot of things that could be better. It's not all negative thinking about low carbon options. And you're right, like I think if we just question some of those things that maybe we think are not changeable, and just kind of allow ourselves to maybe think, yeah, but why do we? Or like, yes, okay, fair enough, like right now public transport is no alternative to owning a car in a lot of places. But what if it was? Like surely, like I always think like transport is definitely one of those things. I'm like, no one loves being stuck in traffic, right? Like everyone hates it. So if we just think about like a city that has great public transport, no cars allowed, everyone can still get around. Surely everyone would love that. You know what I mean? Not everyone, but you know what I mean? Like, like more people would love it than if we just think in like bigger terms and kind of, allow ourselves to restructure things more drastically. Maybe I do think that actually there would be a lot of support and a lot of good things would come out of it, I think.
Coming back to the opening question then, Katharine, as to cli-fi and climate fiction, is it a good idea? Do we need more of it?
I feel like I gave like two answers to this during the discussion. I think generally speaking, it's a good thing. I think the more we talk about climate change, the more we kind of let that enter our thoughts and our conversations about it. I mean, the fact that we're talking about it now, I think it's more a good thing than if it wasn't there, if that makes sense. So yeah, but I think it would also be nice to maybe increase an awareness of actually how cli-fi could really help and move forward some of the discussion in a positive way. So I think yes, it's a good thing. It is, and I see a lot more potential for it to kind of shape our thinking and our conversations and our behaviors about it.
Thank you very much for your time and expertise. I really appreciate you talking to me here with On the Green Fence.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
That's it from On the Green Fence for this week. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you come across a cli-fi novel that is a real page-turner, please do let us know. You can send us a voicemail or email to onthegreenfence@dw.com. And of course, you can also do the same with any questions or feedback you might have. Any ratings or comments that you leave on Apple Podcasts are also very much appreciated, also because that helps us reach more listeners with our content. Many thanks to my colleague and producer Natalie Muller and my sound engineer Thomas Schmidt. And a big thank you to all our listeners for taking the time to listen to On the Green Fence. My name is Neil King. Take it easy and take care.